Hi, everyone. So here we are today in the Summer Law Institute for Integrative Law, and our topic of discussion is taking a trauma-informed approach to our lawyering, our advocacy, and even to law school. So we are having a wonderful experience where there will be time for questions, and I can monitor the chat. So before we begin the formal presentation, I'll be sharing a slideshow. I just wanted to poll for any questions in terms of, is this the first time you're hearing about taking a trauma-informed approach? Did you hear about the book? Have you heard about this approach through Kim, or you're just generally interested in integrative law? So I'll give you a moment to chat in, and if nothing else, you can tell me where you're located. So I'm in Toronto in Canada, and I'm also called to the bar in New York. I worked as a lawyer in conventional law in a large law firm for 15 years. And before that, I remember my first introduction to seeing a link between trauma and the law. I went and I did a project in high school on justice and court monitoring for outcomes in where I grew up in British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. And I remember witnessing a case where it was in criminal court, but really it was a family law matter. So it was a situation where a grandmother was being accused of drug possession while she was caring for her grandchildren and a blended family. And then there was someone else in the mix who was somewhat connected to the family, who was a drug dealer. It was this was the supposed story, and there was really no question as to what was really going on. Why is this situation happening? What else can we do? Does someone need help? How are the children doing? Why is grandmother in this situation? What's the backstory? What's happening? What are people experiencing? What's going on? What's everyone going to go home to, right? And so now, so this is about 30 years ago, and so now, decades later, when we have here where I live legalization and different approaches, I really look back at that and go, oh wow, so many elements of that, of the reality of people's daily lived reality were missing. And so my own basic approach to trauma-informed lawyering is, we hear clients and lawyers alike say that working in our legal system often hurts more than it helps, or at least it hurts more than it should. We have these types of harm that we're not necessarily even aware of, never mind looking at reducing where it's not necessary. Okay, great. So I'm hearing that people are from various locations in the US, and I'm hearing what people that we've heard about some aspects of the approach, but not necessarily the specifics. And I'm really excited to speak with people who are embarking on either a new part of their career or maybe beginning a part of their career, because you get to benefit from the things that other people have learned and come back with lessons in terms of, okay, here's where you can potentially reduce the impact on your well-being. Here's potentially where you can help clients. Here's where you can see system issues. So yeah, so I will get started with my screen share. Great, playing the slideshow from the beginning. Excellent. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about the background, because I am here due to my connection to J. Kim Wright and integrative law. So I remember it was about 2014, 2015, and I had been working on some projects to help people affected by interpersonal violence and also sexual assault. And that's something that I have done for a number of years, actually decades, if I count going back. And so I didn't know how to connect that to my daily practice. And it seemed like it needed to happen, because what was occurring in my own community is I was noticing not just individuals telling me that they had encountered these types of phenomena, but also that either a prior generation or the upcoming generation was encountering it. So these dynamics that I'm talking about, whether the story about the court, where it was the grandmother and the children in a drug situation, or interpersonal violence, or really across the spectrum of types of harm that can occur, I was seeing it happen across generations. And when we see that, it's time to do something. So I created a project website. You can see it listed on the cover slide here. And I started looking at the existing literature and resources on how we deal with adversity of all kinds, especially trauma. Trauma is a situation that overwhelms our human capacity to cope. How do we use tools around that in the law so that we don't need to become consumed by it, so we don't get overwhelmed by it, so that we have tools to use to bring us back to ourselves, to help clients be more of themselves and have more autonomy in the legal process, all of us. So I have a LinkedIn group. You can easily find it there. Also, I've got a Twitter account that's kind of like a research base, and you can find me on Instagram also. In March of this year, myself, Myrna McCollum, who has a podcast on trauma-informed lawyering, Marjorie Florestal, and J. Kim Wright, we released this book. We based it on a series of surveys. So at least 50 lawyers filled out a survey about the impact of trauma and adversity, and also resilience in the profession. We received responses from law students, also judges, law clerks, and we also received submissions and stories from about 50 people as well. About 40 made it into the book, and you can find it in the ABA store. So today we're going to talk about what is trauma and why would we use trauma-informed legal practices. How does it affect our practice? Some tools that we can start to use to address trauma at each level. We'll talk about some tools that you might start using even today, and issues in application, questions that can commonly arise. And that's the layout of the book as well. In the book, what we won't talk about today that is in the book, we talk about system issues, how there needs to be system change. And so I don't want to create the impression that managing trauma is only each of our individual responsibilities. We have systemic injustices, there's systemic racism, of course. There are many systemic issues, and so it is a collective responsibility and not only an individual one, and it is also an intersectional matter. So everyone will have a different perspective on trauma and resilience, and I want to acknowledge also that it's a challenging topic, and so take care of yourself during this presentation. It's not uncommon to feel irritated or frustrated, or to have something come up even talking about this topic. So take care of yourself. If you need to take a break, take notes, grab water. You can always, if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat. Take care of yourself. And so prior to the book, I created a peer-reviewed article that was published here in Canada in the Supreme Court Law Review on trauma-informed lawyering for human rights and public interest law. And then Marjorie Florestal, I wanted to recognize the co-editors of the book. So she's a highly regarded professor at UC Davis, and has also had a background working in immigration. She worked in the Clinton administration and worked, I believe, with a focus on immigration from Haiti. Myrna's podcast, highly recommend you check it out, Trauma-Informed Lawyer. And she interviews very interesting judges, people from across the legal spectrum about their experiences in the system with trauma. And then, of course, Kim and her approach to integrative law. So here with trauma-informed lawyering, we are drawing on mental health law and mental health in general. We're drawing on the idea of having well-being as a pillar. I see that as part of the agenda in terms of this program. And we're also drawing on user experiences, client satisfaction, lawyer satisfaction, and looking at all of those factors in order to increase access to justice and legal services, and also to increase the quality of our experiences and reduce harm where we can, reduce unnecessary harm. So we're going to dive into a bit more detail of what trauma is and why it's important. And so I want to tell you a bit of a story. So I remember in one of my first client matters that I worked on, it involved a series of workplace injuries. I was not the workplace injury specialist. It was something that was in the background and that ended up being larger than we thought it was. And so I noticed two things when this happened. One was that instead of answering questions about what we should do next on matter, the client started saying, "I don't know a lot." And so it seemed that the whole matter was becoming quite overwhelmed, and quite possibly understandably so, by the situation of injury in which they were operating. And also I noticed that in our on our client teams, there was someone working on one of the teams who started talking about workplace injury in the law firm context, and even put up a sign in the office talking about workplace injury. And so it was this situation where what was going on in the background was seeping into the foreground. So that's what you often see with trauma, is that there's a main story, and the main story might appear to be, quote, linear or rational or manageable, but when you include what's going on behind the scenes, what people are not necessarily talking about or including, then you get a fuller picture of how it's impacting our human experiences. And so when speaking with lawyers about trauma and trauma-informed lawyering, they often talk about two things. One, I don't think there's any trauma in my practice. I don't think anyone, including clients, might really have trauma, but everybody's difficult. So this is actually a flag. This is a sign that maybe there is a situation of our human capacities being overwhelmed when we see that we're encountering them as difficult, or they're having a difficult time. And then the other image that people tend to use, I'll ask lawyers and law students, how are things going? And they'll say, my day, it's just putting out fires. And so this idea of urgency, being a first responder, being in a position of being a firefighter, that is actually a position where we do convey that there's some type of overwhelm happening. And so we as advocates were called upon to resolve conflicts in overwhelming situations that are difficult, complex, where people are maybe not at their best, ourselves or others, our colleagues, our community. And so, and I see that traumatic or complex legal matters even overwhelm our system. Even within our system, we don't know how to handle them so much. We always look at legal backlogs, or how many years something will take, or things that are unaddressed, cases that sexual assault is an example. So, where I live, less than 5% of cases have really a resolution. And we can, that's a topic for another day in terms of that specialized topic. And so the idea is it can overwhelm us at numerous levels: the individual level, the relationship level, and the group level, including the system level. So it's this sense of working constantly in emergency mode, working in stress response. And so another analogy I like to use is there's a great story that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about. And Thich Nhat Hanh is a well-known peace activist and mindfulness and Buddhist Dharma instructor. And Thich Nhat Hanh had a story about how do we treat others and ourselves when there's an emergency. And so the story goes as follows. A good Samaritan was wandering through the village and saw that there was someone yelling from a burning house from the second floor, saying, "Help, help, someone set fire to my house, there's been an arson." And so the Good Samaritan said to the person on the second floor, "Okay, wait, I'll go find the arsonist." Now, this is a kind of help, but it's a help that doesn't necessarily address the full situation. That person in the house is still on the second floor yelling and still in danger in terms of the fire. And then also, how is the Good Samaritan equipped? Do they have any type of equipment? Is there someone to help? Is their focus such that it includes their own safety, whether or not they're running after the arsonist or they're helping the person in the house? So the idea is to have an emergency or a backup plan, a plan that addresses both the main story of what we are called upon to do on a daily basis in legal practice, and also the backstory, where it's this obstacle course where we're trying to put out fires. And so why would we do this? So why is it so important? It's important because of the high prevalence of trauma. In Canada and also in the United States, it's estimated that at least 2/3 of people are affected by some kind of trauma. So in Canada, it's 63 to 64%, and in the United States, it's usually measured on a state level. And so there was a series of studies done in the 1990s about adverse childhood experiences, indicating that almost 2/3 of participants report at least one type of adversity growing up. And that's limited to, quote unquote, limited to childhood, right? And so that's meaning to say that there are broader factors than that. And so when we put a person who has experienced adversity in a situation where they need to advocate for themselves and they're in a system that can determine their level of freedom or their choices, it's not really a surprise that there might be a conflict there. And the statistic that really woke me up to this being an issue is by a finding by Nadine Burke-Harris, who wrote The Deepest Well and is an expert on adverse childhood experiences. And she talks about the impact of trauma on learning and behavior. So law and lawyering is a co-learning experience. We're always learning about our client, and no matter what our role is, and our client is learning what they need to do, what the system expects of them, how we'll work together. And when trauma is present, when more than one factor of trauma is present, learning and behavior can be 28 to 32 times more likely to be affected, as in potentially diminished. A person may not have their full learning capacity versus when trauma hasn't been present in the background in their history. So trauma-informed lawyering is looking beyond the surface. In law school, we're taught to focus on conscious, cognitive, intellectual matters only. You know, is this person credible? Is their narrative linear? Is their memory linear? Where are the holes? And we're looking beyond that. We're looking below the surface to how are we experiencing each other, and how is the client experiencing the legal system and our interactions from the level of communication, also body, mind, their sense of meaning, their sense of values. We're looking beyond the surface, including culture and where people are coming from in general. And I mentioned benefits at the beginning. And so one point that people raise as an objection is, oh, this takes more time, it costs in terms of training. And my own experience with that is what trauma-informed lawyering does is it supports and accelerates trust. If you are willing, you show a client the willingness to step into their shoes, to look at something from their perspective, to understand where they're coming from, both in terms of their backstory as well as the main story of what's going on, they're more likely to give you better information, to disclose more. They might have a sense that things are productive, and so they may feel more engaged in the process. And there are some non-obvious connections as well, in terms of the connections between trauma-informed lawyering and our system. So, you know, clients don't necessarily have confidence in the justice system. And so all of these elements of dissatisfaction, one way that we can potentially address it is taking a trauma-informed approach that includes their experience of overwhelm and also has concrete tips and tools for communication that can come through in the process itself in terms of client interviews and how their story is structured into what is submitted to a court or included in a document. And so an important connection for you is trauma-informed approaches can usually make our practice more sustainable. So there's a great quote by a health practitioner, Rachel Naomi Remen, who talks about, from an integrative health perspective, how experiencing suffering with our clients without getting wet from the suffering ourselves is about as realistic as walking through a river without expecting to get wet. So this idea that she's talking about basically the image of a river of suffering. And so when we go into something that involves suffering with our client, it is not realistic to expect ourselves to be unaffected, and that is vicarious or secondary trauma. So there are various other impacts. There's well-known attrition factors in the legal profession. Supporting trauma supports our mental health. It also helps us make meaning, and it gets us out of traps like gladiator mindset, which is a term that is used in my own community, where the idea is that nothing impacts us, that nothing should or can impact us. So I'm going to invite you, as I go through the rest of the material, to think about, okay, how does this connect to me or my community? What might be helpful in terms of my practice now or in the future? Who can I talk to about it, and where can I look for further resources? Because this topic is mushrooming, especially across the United States. Oregon, Massachusetts, I believe, New York, certainly California, state by state, depending on what's going on in the state, it's a growing practice at every level. And there are certain states like Oregon that have decided to become trauma-informed in terms of across the board. So now we're going to dive into a little more detail. What does a trauma response look like? It doesn't look organized. It looks very disorganized. It looks like something that doesn't make sense. It often shows up in terms of a spaghetti bowl or a tossed salad of factors that feel like something is going on, but we can't quite put our finger on it. It's not always obvious when someone is in the survival response of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And fawn is the idea of appeasement, so people pleasing or trying to be pleasant in a situation to avoid conflict. And so there are so many factors that feed into it. We're going to look at 3 today. We're going to look at biology, psychology, and our social relations. But in the background, we have all of these other factors. We have intergenerational patterns, culture, the systemic and institutional cultures as well, conflict patterns, what's happened in the community. So all of this feeds into what shows up on the surface in your own practice in terms of the client, yourself, and your colleagues. And so as lawyers and law students, we would love to organize things so that it's linear, so that there's a definitive approach where we can check the box, where we can identify something specifically. Trauma is hard to put our finger on. And so I'll tell you about a few trauma experts' definitions of this phenomenon. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, talks about trauma in terms of anything that overwhelms the body's ability to cope. Peter Levine frames it as anything that's too much or comes too fast. And my favorite definition is by Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia, who runs a trauma-informed training program through the Harvard Medical System. And Alicia talks about trauma as being a fear signal that doesn't turn off. And so we'll talk about the neurobiology of that in a moment. But what happens in terms of when our entire being is affected by this fear signal, the idea that threat is present, and it may well be present in a situation affecting a client. It affects us at numerous levels, and it shows up in different ways biologically. We or our colleagues' sleep patterns may be disrupted. We may not be able to eat. We may have pain. Our mobility may be restricted. In terms of our psychology, we may be dominated by fear-oriented thoughts and emotions. It may interfere with our learning and memory. Imagine asking someone to take a quiz when they have just experienced a fearful situation. It can affect our worldview, thinking that everything is full of threat or potentially a threat. And especially it can affect our relationships, because often trauma comes to us through the vehicle of a person, someone who has done something or not done something, or, we've been failed by someone or a system. And so it can affect our ability to trust, even in a lawyer-client relationship, affect our ability to communicate, to listen, to attune to each other, and to have a proper rhythm of communications in terms of whether we're giving someone too much, we're inundating them, or we're giving them too little, we're withdrawing. So it's really not a checklist. It's more of an overall schema. And people talk about trauma-informed practice as being a lens-based practice. It's how we see things. And then the tools that we use are basically our method of doing things. And if we wanted to dive into the neurobiology of trauma for a moment, so what really happens is, so we have the triune brain, a 3-level brain where the brainstem keeps our heart beating, it keeps our systems functioning. Then we have our limbic system, which deals with pleasure and pain and also fear, and that's in the middle of the brain. And then we have the neocortex, the gray matter outside the brain, that deals with logic, planning, our conscious responses. And so when trauma happens, what we don't learn in law school, or sometimes even in psychology, is that the limbic brain is faster. It responds more quickly than the neocortex, than the gray matter, than our decision-making and thought processing area of the brain. And so we then become guided or dominated by that zone of our brain, by the limbic system. And so what happens is the amygdala, a structure in the limbic brain, is an area that senses alarm. It's basically like a fire alarm in the brain. So when we sense a threat, whether that threat is real or perceived, the amygdala is triggered, and the hippocampus, which is apparently, it looks like a seahorse, it's a structure underneath the amygdala, it becomes focused on pumping hormones that will help us endure pain, help us run, help us survive. It helps us pump cortisol so that we can survive a situation. Otherwise, it would help us record memory. So we don't learn that. I was actually surprised myself to learn that our brains kind of have a dual function, at least dual function scenario, where we, in survival mode, we are not focused on remembering. Why remember what you can't maybe survive, right? And so when we look at trauma impacted evidence, which is a term actually, that's why it can look a bit less linear. It can look like a story that is impacted by trauma can look like Swiss cheese. You know, details might be missing. We might not remember the color of a car that was coming towards us. We might not remember what a person's face looked like when there was a threat present. And so how does this impact our practice of co-learning with clients and acting in their best interests? And so what happens in terms of communication is you will see lack of clarity. You'll see, so functional communication is a system of serve and return. I have the ball, I serve you the ball, you get the ball, you serve the ball back to me. And so you'll see either too little or too much. It might be disorganized. People might ghost you, or they might give you something that's not relevant. And so it can definitely show up in communication, and that might be the area where you see it first. Also, it shows up in our habits, our health habits, our own habits in terms of social habits, our awareness of others. So when a threat is present, it's natural that we will focus on that perceived threat, whether or not it is real. And then it shows up in our system, right? Whether our system is transparent, whether it's predictable, whether people feel like they are going to be treated fairly or not. And our system is characterized by various assumptions and beliefs about trauma. And so one of the beliefs that shows up in our system is what's called the fundamental attribution error. And so the fundamental attribution error is a cognitive error where we think that what we do is due to our situation and what someone else does is due to a character flaw or personality. And so a common example for this phenomenon is if we are in traffic and we're driving and someone cuts us off, we might assume, oh, that person, they're a bad driver, they're reckless, they're mean, they have a disregard for human life, they're negligent. Whereas that person, in terms of the person who cut us off, they are more aware of their situation. They're thinking, oh, I have to go get my parent from the hospital. I'm late. I'm in pain. And so we don't account for that in our analysis in terms of credibility or otherwise in legal processes. So we're going to go a bit more into this theme of looking beyond the surface and put our neurobiology and factors we've discussed so far into a model. So part of the complexity of trauma is that we're not looking at neurobiology alone or any other aspect alone. It's a triangle, right? So we're looking at our biological, psychological, and social aspects of our experience. And Catherine Porterfield, who is a contributor to the book, talks about trauma as being a biopsychosocial experience. It's something that we have a physical response to, even simply in the brain when we're reading a document about something that is threatening. It's something that we have a psychological response of fear to, and then we also have a fearful social response. And so how it shows up in the triangle and not just in the brain is it shows up in our mental health, our emotional well-being, our cognitive biases like the fundamental attribution error, and otherwise in our thinking patterns. Socially, it can show up in our communication, whether we're attuned with others or not, whether we give them the benefit of the doubt, whether we behave relationally or more transactionally, like, please, just the facts, please. I don't have time to get to know you or even say hi. It shows up in our legal culture, and it shows up even deeper in our biology in terms of our nervous systems. We are usually in sympathetic mode, which is the mode that helps us act, rather than parasympathetic mode, which helps us rest and digest. And also in our hormones where we have high cortisol. And I wanted to give you, before we talk about tools, a few examples of how trauma is seen in terms of its impact on advocacy and social issues using other frameworks. So a key framework that is prevalent in the United States particularly is the Adverse Childhood Experiences ACEs framework. And I want to emphasize that, so ACEs talks about trauma transmission to some extent, as well as how trauma is experienced by children, talks about how it's experienced by families. And the latest research on trauma indicates that not only trauma can be transmitted, but resilience can be transmitted as well. So the offset for adverse childhood experiences is structuring positive experiences. And Dr. Bruce Perry in particular talks about this, that one key factor that helps when it comes to supporting children and families is to have an anchor of some kind of positive relationship, a teacher, a counselor, someone in the community, a relative, a parent, a friend of the family, someone who is engaging in positive experiences, supportive, loving, positive, strength-based relations with a child and other members of the family. So what we see here on the slide is what's called the pair of ACEs. And so in the 1990s, Dr. Vincent Felitti and his colleagues did a survey of 17,000 people and found that certain types of adversity in childhood, they identified 10 types, were actually directly related to long-term health impacts. They also found that there is what's called a dose-response relationship between stress and health. So the more of these that one person experiences, the more likely that there's going to be a health impact. And so these 10 factors are what's at the top of the tree here. And more generally speaking, those factors are factors that involve neglect, mental health situations, mental health impact, or abuse. And so if there's domestic violence, if a family experiences mental illness, if someone is imprisoned or involved in the justice system, if there's a divorce, if there's some type of physical, emotional neglect, if there's outright abuse, or if there's lack of safety in the home in terms of inconsistent housing, those are factors that can affect health and also learning and behavior by a factor of 28 times when it comes to learning and behavior or more, like 28 times more likely to have problems. And then what the ACEs approach also observed, is that this is not something that is in isolation, in a vacuum, in a person, or even in a family. It's something that is structured by our communities. It's structured by our systemic violence, our systemic racism, our systemic lack of housing or low quality of housing, poverty, various forms of discrimination, all forms of discrimination, all forms of community disruption, any type of lack of opportunity. And so it's really important to think about our clients and ourselves in this way, that we are the trees, our clients are the trees, we and they have roots in the community, and what shows up in our offices, in our courtrooms, you know, in terms of the branches of the tree, what is visible on the outside is not because of some flaw or weakness. It's actually rooted in a centuries grounded situation where people have experienced adversity, and we can offset that with positive reinforcements. And so a mental framework that I like to use in terms of how to think about clients is, whenever we're working with a client, seeing them as a tree, but looking at them as if we're looking from the top down. We can look at ourselves in this way. Trauma-informed practice is a reflective practice. So looking at the client in terms of, okay, what do they need to remember? What do they need to trust me? What do they need in terms to actually tell their story? What types of harm are they experiencing? How can that be reduced? Is there a form of safety that can be supported here that they're not experiencing, whether that's physical location, level of privacy, how they wish to tell their story, whether we can use video or whether we can use something that is illustrated as opposed to having to say certain things. Also, how are they affected by their own culture and the culture of the legal system or my culture? How do we have cultural humility in that regard? What are their procedural needs, process needs? What type of adaptations might they have to this process? So seeing people in terms of those roots and those branches and their needs, being surrounded by their needs and also their strengths, what strengths they have. So a question to consider at this point is this something that sounds either familiar or potentially helpful? Do you notice in terms of your own law training, your legal training, is this something that has only focused on the intellectual, cognitive, conscious? Have some of these factors been included? If so, how? That's the first question. The second question is about context. So in trauma-informed lawyering, we talk about and focus on social context, where someone is coming from, an experience that a person has that I might not immediately understand, so I need to learn to understand, whether that is rooted in different abilities or perspectives. And so how do we take context into account? Brian Stevenson, in particular, is a proponent of this approach. Brian is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and Brian's word for this is proximity. He talks about establishing proximity with clients and understanding things closer to the ground in terms of where they're coming from and what they're experiencing, so we can better advocate for them. And so now we're going to talk about tools. I just want to check and see if there are any obvious questions here. I think I can see our participants, but I may not be able to see questions here, so please feel free to flag me. Okay, so tools. So it's a complex topic. We've had quite a mouthful in terms of talking about this topic so far. And what I want to encourage you to remember is that for each factor of impact, there is potentially an offsetting factor of support, a tool. So where we have transactional communications in the legal system, just the facts, please, are you credible or not, we can offset that with relational communications and trauma-informed communication strategies, where we prioritize connection, learning, and really getting to earn a person's trust. On the psychological side, we have normalizing mental health impacts. You know, in a profession where our job is to argue all day and to deal with problematic issues all day, it's not a surprise that there are mental health impacts, right? When we're constantly going into stress response. We can normalize and use emotional intelligence skills. We can look at our cognitive biases or the cognitive tendencies that emerge in our field. And even biologically, we can have awareness of stress response states. You can learn about things like polyvagal theory, which we won't get into in this seminar, but is discussed briefly in the book. We can notice the difference between our parasympathetic and sympathetic states, whether we are in our rest and digest state or whether we are in a heightened stress cortisol pumping state. And we can bring in physiological supports ranging from exercise through to mindfulness exercises and other types of awareness building practices. And so here we have an illustration of the tools. This is an illustration that's inspired by the book. And so the point of this illustration is that while trauma touches on three fundamental points of human experience, we have so many more tools that we can use to address it, starting with communication, also including cultural humility, anti-racism, anti-discrimination tools. So we're going around the wheel from starting with communication and down and to the left. We can engage in relational practices. We can be conscious about our relationship formation, which isn't always taught in conventional law school. We can use embodied practices. We can support mental health and well-being in ourselves and others. We can support emotional awareness and intelligence. We can engage in meaning-making practices, including our values, our sense of the big picture in our community, and our spirituality. And we can also see legal practice in terms of the impact on collective health, collective well-being, and bring a lens of collective care as well as self-care to the process. So if there were only one phrase that you could use with a client or yourself to bring this practice into daily use, it would be shifting from assumptions to questions about our experiences that may include trauma. So at the beginning, I talked about how a flag that trauma may be present is seeing people as difficult, whether that's others or ourselves. Oh, that client is so difficult. Or sometimes I hear lawyers say that client seems unsophisticated. And so I do wonder if that is also a flag where someone is seeing or assuming that there is something awry in how someone is processing information, where there may be a cause. It's, that person is an intelligent person, or our clients have strengths, and so they are taken out of those strengths when there's a perceived threat. So a key assumption is that this person, whether it's myself, a colleague, or others, has a problem. And so instead of saying, what is that person's problem, we ask, what does that client experience? What has that person experienced? What's happening for them? And we can ask that directly. We may not always be able to ask it directly, but we can ask versions of it directly. What comes up for you when I send you this list of 12 questions that you need to fill out in detail that you've probably never talked to anyone about? And we use this translation from assumption to question in other spheres. So most importantly, I want to emphasize for today, the one at the bottom, the assumption that only clients are affected by the suffering in a legal situation. And Rachel Naomi Remen, and also experts on vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, see that is false. And so we need to ask ourselves, what do we experience? What have I experienced? What do we experience by witnessing what's going on with a client, whatever their struggle or suffering may be, what's happening in ourselves? And other versions of that can help are in relationship formation. We'll often assume, I'm qualified. I went through all this schooling. I put in the hard work. I'm going to assume the client should trust me because I'm a lawyer. And really, we need to ask, what does this specific person in their situation, given their context and their predispositions and any type of response that they may have to trauma, what do they need to feel safe? What do they need to trust to disclose in our relationship? We also assume that clients just need to respond to the process and provide information. And instead we can ask, what types of supports or processes does the client need in order to work together effectively? And often I see an assumption where a lawyer might assume that a person is problematic or not credible if they can't get their story straight, if they can't remember something. And so we need to ask, what is the broader context of memory formation? What is the broader context for this client's story, for their memory, for their narrative? And there are actually specialized practices for this, specialized practices for trauma-informed interviewing. And so that's something that is mentioned in the book in terms of current practices that you can use in support of this approach. And I want to emphasize in terms of if you're looking for a resource on culture, humility, anti-racism, anti-discrimination, Myrna McCollum's Trauma-Informed Lawyer podcast has some of these. Overall, trauma-informed advocacy is an approach that seeks to include. We're including everything possible that we can about a person in order to help them, right? Including their experience from a cultural perspective. And it's important to note that there are emerging findings about the impact of racism, ostracism, and other experiences that children have or are aware of, that a child doesn't necessarily need to experience discrimination directly for them to be impacted. And this is a finding from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So in terms of legal wellness and lawyer well-being, an important resource is Nadine Burke-Harris, who is now the Surgeon General for the state of California. And in her book, The Deepest Well, she talks about a study that she did in San Francisco about health supports that can elevate a person's experience and buffer them against the impact of adversity. So she had a clinic in her prior role in San Francisco where she was looking at community health, and she tested different types of community health supports and individual health supports, and she found that there are 6 key factors to support health in the face of adversity. So it can prevent the impact of trauma. It's not necessarily a healing approach to trauma. I'm not a therapist, I'm a lawyer and a consultant. And so the therapy is another matter. However, something that can help prevent the impact of trauma includes the following 6 factors: adequate sleep, healthy nutrition, healthy, regular exercise, nutrition, I'm sorry, I already mentioned nutrition, mindfulness, and mindfulness practice, healthy relationships, and mental health support. So this may sound like an unremarkable list of items that a family member might remind you about on a vacation. Oh, you're on vacation? Oh, good. Finally, you're not stressed. You should do the following things. But what these strategies are these are strategies of non-fear. These are strategies that put your body, your mind, and all aspects of our being in a state that is more likely to be at rest and not in fear, in a state of safety. So to me, it's not a surprise that mental health is highly impacted in the legal profession. These are health supports that we are somewhat taught in the culture of the profession to let slip away, right? I remember as a law student or in the beginning of my practice, I let sleep fall, meals were not regular, exercise fell by the wayside. I didn't necessarily have any type of mindfulness practice, even sort of focusing on my breath or even any kind of awareness. I didn't have enough time for my relationships. And so I would skip out on family meals or other engagements with friends. Those would fall by the wayside. And so the one pillar left standing would be mental health, right? So if all of those other ones fall away, the one pillar left standing is mental health. So I'm going to ask you, which of these supports for you, which of these are easiest to access? Which are your strengths? Trauma-informed lawyering is a strengths-based approach. We want to reinforce the humanity of our clients, ourselves, our community. So which of these are easier for you to access and which of these are less easy? Which areas is it easier to fall off track? Which goes first? I know for me, it's sleep. Kim, who obviously is involved in this Summer Institute, she'll joke that she knows something is going on when I'm sending an email late at night. So noticing your own well-being waterfall is key. So now we're going to move into application and some questions. We've got enough time for questions and some areas of application. So I was thinking about what might be your focus as integrative lawyers or aspiring integrative lawyers applying trauma-informed practice on a daily basis. So first you'll want to notice, first you'll want to be aware, and it's not always pleasant to look around and go, oh, you know what, 40% of my practice involves trauma because I'm dealing with bankruptcy or, a half employment practice and half general corporate. Or maybe family practice, maybe that it means that the majority of your practice can be impacted by trauma. And the thing to know here is that when we did the survey for the book, there is no area of practice that is completely unaffected by trauma because it's not the external experience, it's the internal experience. It's the experience of the threat, the fear alarm that won't go off. So first we want to have a noticing practice and notice where this might be a factor, where overwhelm in general, difficulty, or feeling like you're putting out fires is happening. And so with integrative law, we include ourselves, we include our humanity. So the personal nature of your practice might be a factor. The frontline nature of your practice might be a factor. You might be hearing things that you haven't heard or before, or that people haven't told you before. I'll get more into that. And also meaning making, because integrative law is something that includes our values. So practice area distinctions. So anything that touches on a person's life in any way is potentially more likely to be experienced as traumatic, whether that is their employment, their finances, the state of their relationships, their reputation, anything involving, I know that there's a wills and estates segment in the Summer Institute, so anything that involves life planning or dignity in general. And so anything involving a personal matter, for sure, you can expect that it's possible that trauma and resilience would be something to pay attention to. In integrative law, we are including ourselves and the humanity of our process. And so something that we need to be aware of is that there's something that's called survival learning that happens in a legal context, especially a complex one. And this comes out of research around both learning and trauma and was examined by the Federal Department of Justice here in Canada. So survival learning is the following. If something complex or difficult traumatic happens to one of your clients, the first person they're going to trust to answer their questions about that situation is potentially not you. It's one of their friends or family members that they already trust. And so we can see sometimes that a client will come to us with an impression of a situation, or they may have asked 3 family members and 2 friends, and they'll tell us what those people said. And it is because of how we are primed to communicate. And also, as lawyers, we are in a very privileged and also sensitive position where we're getting to hear about things that people often have been discouraged from telling anyone else. So you might often hear people say, oh, I've not told anyone else this before. You're the only person I've told, or I was told not to tell anyone, or is it okay if I tell you these things that I was told to tell no one else? And so there is a threat even in that they've been told, oh, even your communication is a threat. And so we have a higher need then to approach such communications with empathy, with non-judgment of self and other, and to engage in relational communication where we have some basis of relating. We see what the client's strengths are, what their needs are, rather than taking a check the box approach. Please give me the facts, like we're not humans. And a third factor, and I really appreciate Kim's approach to this, where she includes values, whether it's in conscious contracts or generally in integrative law, including ourselves. You know, her question, can I be myself and still be a lawyer? So often there is an unaddressed moral aspect to our legal issues. There's something about a legal issue that we can't necessarily address in a legal process. So Jonathan Shea is a researcher on what's called moral injury. It intersects with trauma. And so Jonathan has studied moral injury largely in the setting of combat. And so moral injury is a kind of psychological injury that happens when our values are fundamentally contravened. And it might be witnessing someone else's values and their sense of freedom, their sense of fairness being contravened, or our own. And any kind of cycle of dysfunction can affect our values, affect our sense of meaning, affect our sense of what is moral and good and who we are as lawyers and what we can do for our clients. And so in terms of the presence of moral injury, which is offset by moral repair in situations involving trauma, we can ask ourselves, does this process either exacerbate, make worse, or replicate a kind of harm, right? So here we can think about an example might be if someone was harmed at a school, and whether as a teenager or as an adult, if there was a situation of discrimination or some other type of harm, and if they pursue a legal process after that harm, does in the telling of the harm or in the questioning about it, does there emerge, is there some type of aspect of the process that replicates the original harm? Are they not believed? Are they given a discriminatory questionnaire? Are their concerns diminished? Is the cultural approach that they have not included? Is gender discrimination a factor? And discrimination isn't the only factor in moral injury and moral repair. So we're looking at also, you can think of an example in health law. Is there something about the prolonged court process, where maybe it takes 2 or 3 years to prove malpractice, where the person is suffering at the same time and having to prove yet more injury? And so moral repair is where we engage in a meaning-making process. What can this situation ultimately mean for the client down the road? What can it mean for their family? What does it mean for me in my practice? How can I draw on my own values of fairness around freedom, or any other values I might have in terms of how I might bring best practices to this situation over time? And a person that you may be interested in consulting further about this is Jennifer Frage. She talks about institutional courage and institutional betrayal, and that's when institutions have moral injury and moral repair. And so moral injury is when our moral compass is damaged. So I've got a few other tips here that I can go through, and I want to go into questions because I can just I'm looking at the time, the practical things to think about. I think what emerges to me as we're carrying on with the Summer Institute here today is that we can assume that trauma isn't active, that we're post when we're in a situation of advocacy, when we're advocating for a client, but that's not always the case. So I've sent the presentation to the session leaders here, and so I want to open to questions here, either in the chat box or otherwise. And on my website, my personal website, there's a free download. If you want to get a resilience reminder tip sheet, you can also leave a review. And there's also a free download on the website traumainformedlaw.org, another of my websites, where there's a free frequently asked questions guide. And those are my socials. So I will leave the free download there, and I will stop my share.